You wouldn't understand these things, Richard. It's complicated finance, my daughter-in-law said, as if I were a child who had wandered into the wrong room. She didn't even look at me when she said it. She was standing in my kitchen, sunlight pouring across the granite countertops I had paid off 20 years ago, holding my bank statement between two perfectly manicured fingers like it was something fragile and slightly embarrassing. I remember the way she sighed, soft but deliberate, the way people do when they think patience makes them superior. I was sitting at the head of the table, wearing my old gray cardigan, the one with the loose thread near the cuff. I didn't correct her. I didn't remind her that I had been managing money since before she was born. I just nodded and folded my hands. That was the moment I realized she truly believed I was just a helpless old man living off whatever scraps were left in my savings account. After my wife, Eleanor, passed away 3 years ago, I let the world think I had shrunk. I sold the lake house. I traded in my Mercedes for a 10-year-old Buick. I stopped wearing tailored suits and started shopping at the local hardware store in sneakers that cost less than a decent dinner. Grief makes you quieter. It makes you less interested in proving anything. My son, Daniel, mistook that quiet for decline. Angela mistook it for weakness. They started stopping by more often, bringing takeout, offering to help with bills. At first, I thought it was kindness. Then I noticed the questions. How many accounts did I have? Was the house fully paid off? Had I considered consolidating assets? Angela asked those questions the way some people ask about the weather. Light, casual, but never accidental. I would watch her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. Sharp, measuring, calculating. One afternoon she suggested we go to the bank together. It's just easier if I'm authorized, she said with a bright smile. In case anything happens. Anything happens. I'm 74, not a ticking clock. I've had the same primary care doctor for 15 years. I walk 2 miles every morning, and my blood pressure is better than Daniel's. But I let her believe what she wanted. The following Friday, we drove to Whitmore and Hale Community Bank, the brick building on Main Street with the white columns and the flag that's always raised before 9 a.m. I hadn't been inside in over a year. Angela walked half a step ahead of me, heels clicking confidently against the sidewalk. Inside, she approached the counter first. We need to discuss adding my name to his accounts, she told the young teller, lowering her voice slightly on the word his, as if I weren't standing right there. The teller glanced at me, then froze for half a second. That half second told me everything. Recognition flickered across her face. She straightened. "One moment, please," she said politely, and disappeared into the back office. Angela shifted her weight, impatience creeping into her posture. "See?" she murmured to me. "This is exactly why I need to handle these things." I looked around the lobby. The same polished floors. The same framed photographs of the town from decades past. My photograph used to hang there too, right beside the founders. I had asked them to take it down when I retired. I didn't like reminders. A door opened behind the counter. The branch manager stepped out quickly, smoothing his tie as he walked toward us, and when his eyes met mine, his entire expression changed. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, extending both hands. "It's an honor to see you again." Angela went very still beside me. I offered a small smile. I had never been helpless. I had simply chosen to be quiet. Angela did not speak for the rest of the visit. She stood beside me while the branch manager, Thomas Reed, asked about my health, about my morning walks, about whether I still preferred my coffee black with 1 spoon of sugar. I could feel her confusion without even looking at her. When Thomas offered to review my accounts privately in his office, I declined. I told him everything was exactly the way I wanted it. That part was true. On the drive home, Angela kept her eyes on the road, even though she was not the one driving. Daniel had met us there after work, summoned by a short message from his wife that simply said, "We need to talk to your father." My son looked uneasy, the way he used to look before a math test in high school. He cleared his throat and asked why the manager seemed to know me so well. I told him. I had worked there a long time ago. I did not elaborate. Silence is powerful when you let it stretch. Back at my house, Angela moved through the living room slowly, as if she were seeing it for the first time. The framed photos, the oak bookshelf, the piano that Eleanor used to play every Sunday afternoon. I could almost see the numbers recalculating behind her eyes. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my usual chair by the window. Outside, the maple tree in the front yard swayed in the late afternoon breeze. I planted that tree the year Daniel turned 10. It is taller than the roof now. People assume that because you age, you fade. They do not understand that some of us spent decades building foundations so solid that we no longer need to prove anything. I spent 32 years inside that bank. I started as a junior loan officer at 26 years old, fresh out of business school, wearing suits that did not quite fit, and carrying a briefcase that cost more than my first month of rent. I worked through recessions, through market crashes, through years when farmers in this county thought they would lose everything. By the time I was 55, I was president of the main branch. I knew every business owner within a 50-mile radius. I approved loans that built grocery stores, hardware shops, and 2 churches. When I retired at 71, the board asked me to stay on as an advisor. I agreed quietly. I never told Angela. I never felt the need to. That evening, Daniel finally asked the question that had been hanging in the air since the bank. He sat across from me at the dining table and said, "Dad, why did they call you Mr. Whitmore like that?" I looked at him for a long moment. My son is a good man, but he has always been too quick to let louder voices guide him. I told him that respect is earned over time, not demanded in a single afternoon. Angela folded her arms and forced a small laugh, saying she had no idea I had been so involved there. I simply nodded. The truth is, I had stepped back on purpose after Eleanor passed. Grief stripped me down to what mattered. I did not need the title. I did not need the corner office. What I needed was peace. But peace should never be mistaken for weakness. As the evening light faded and their car pulled out of my driveway, I realized something had shifted. Angela no longer saw me as harmless. She saw that there was more beneath the surface. And that was exactly where I intended to keep it for now. The following week, Angela began calling more often than usual, always in the late morning when she knew I would be home from my walk, but before Daniel finished work, and her tone had changed from polite concern to careful curiosity, as if she were trying to assemble a puzzle without letting me see the picture on the box. She asked casual questions about retirement plans, about whether I had ever considered moving into a smaller place, about how complicated it must be to keep track of investments at my age, and each time I answered slowly and simply, never lying, never offering more than necessary. I told her my bills were paid, my roof did not leak, and my furnace had been serviced before winter. What I did not tell her was that every quarter I still received detailed reports from the advisory board, that my name remained on documents far thicker than the bank statements she had waved in my kitchen. One afternoon she stopped by unannounced carrying a folder and a bright, rehearsed smile. She sat across from me at the dining table and spread out a few printed pages that she said would make things easier for everyone if I would just sign them. She explained that it was a durable power of attorney, nothing dramatic, just paperwork in case I ever became confused or ill. She spoke slowly, over-enunciating certain words as if clarity required volume. I read every line without rushing. I have reviewed contracts worth millions of dollars. I can read at a steady pace without assistance. The document would have given her broad authority over my financial accounts, property decisions, and investment movements. I looked up at her and asked why Daniel was not present for this discussion. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before saying he trusted her judgment. That sentence told me more than she realized. Trust is valuable currency, and she was spending his freely. I folded the papers neatly and slid them back toward her, telling her I would have my attorney review them first. She blinked twice, surprised. "I do not currently require a power of attorney," I added calmly. "My physician confirms that my cognitive health is excellent." There was a tightness around her smile now. She said she was only trying to help, that managing finances can be overwhelming for someone in their 70s. I asked her if I seemed overwhelmed. The room grew quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock Eleanor and I bought on our 20th anniversary. Angela gathered her papers with deliberate movements and stood, smoothing her skirt as though dignity could be pressed back into place. After she left, I remained at the table for a long time, considering not the document itself but the intention behind it. When someone shows you who they believe you are, it reveals what they hope to gain. That evening Daniel called and asked if I had reviewed what Angela brought over. His voice carried a hint of defensiveness, as though he anticipated resistance. I told him I had, and that I preferred to handle my own affairs for the time being. He said they were only thinking about the future. I told him the future is built on respect in the present. He did not respond immediately. I could almost hear him weighing loyalty against discomfort. After we ended the call, I walked to my study and opened the top drawer of my desk where a leather folder rested beneath old photographs. Inside were copies of trusts, corporate agreements, and a letter from the board reaffirming my advisory position. I closed the drawer gently. I had no intention of escalating anything, but I was no longer observing passively. Angela believed she was guiding a confused old man toward decisions he could not comprehend. She did not yet understand that I had spent a lifetime guiding others through storms far more complicated than this. And storms, when they approach slowly, give you time to prepare. 3 days after the power of attorney conversation, I received a call from Thomas Reed at the bank, and his voice carried the careful tone professionals use when they are navigating something delicate. He informed me that someone had inquired again about adding an authorized signer to one of my primary accounts, and although no changes had been made, he felt it was appropriate to alert me directly. I thanked him for the courtesy and assured him that any modifications would come from me in writing. After I ended the call, I sat in my study and allowed the silence to settle. The house was steady around me. The same walls that had heard Daniel practice spelling words at the kitchen table. The same hallway where Eleanor once hung holiday wreaths every December. There is a difference between concern and strategy. Concern checks in. Strategy circles back when the first attempt does not succeed. That afternoon, Angela appeared again, this time with Daniel beside her, and their expressions were aligned in a way that told me they had rehearsed something on the drive over. Daniel began speaking first, explaining that they were only trying to ensure everything was organized in case of emergencies. Angela added that most people my age simplify their assets to avoid confusion later. I listened without interrupting. When they finished, I asked Daniel how often he had reviewed his own retirement accounts in the past year. He looked surprised by the question and admitted he had not had much time. I nodded and said that clarity requires discipline at any age. I then explained, calmly and without embellishment, that my estate planning had been structured years ago with the assistance of experienced attorneys and that it remained under regular review. Angela's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recalculation. She asked whether that meant everything was already allocated. I told her that responsible planning does not require public announcements. The air shifted again, subtle but unmistakable. Daniel shifted in his seat and asked if there was something he did not know. I looked at my son and saw a man caught between loyalty and uncertainty. I told him there was nothing to worry about, only that my financial affairs were neither neglected nor vulnerable. I did not mention the trust agreements or the advisory stipends. I did not mention the private investments tied to regional development projects. Information has weight, and I have learned over decades that you do not place weight into hands that have not demonstrated steadiness. Angela pressed once more, suggesting that transparency prevents misunderstandings. I agreed with her in principle and said transparency also depends on trust. That word lingered in the room longer than any raised voice could have. Eventually they left, their departure quieter than their arrival. Through the front window, I watched their car reverse down the driveway, brake lights glowing red against the early evening sky. I knew this was no longer about paperwork. It was about control. It was about perception. Angela had believed that age equaled fragility, that grief equaled confusion, that modest clothing and an older car equaled limitation. She had misread simplicity as scarcity. Later that night, I opened my study drawer again and reviewed my documents. Not because I doubted them, but because clarity strengthens resolve. I made one phone call to my attorney and scheduled a routine review of my estate plan, nothing dramatic, simply an update. If there was to be any shift in power, it would not come from pressure. It would come from intention. And intention, when built over a lifetime, is not easily undone. The meeting with my attorney took place on a quiet Tuesday morning in an office that smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. And as I sat across from him reviewing documents that had been carefully structured over decades, I felt something I had not felt in months, which was certainly sharpened by clarity. We went over every trust, every beneficiary designation, every contingency clause, and I made only minor adjustments. Nothing emotional, nothing impulsive, just refinements that reflected present realities instead of past assumptions. I did not remove Daniel from anything. I did not punish anyone. I simply added conditions tied to responsibility and personal accountability, the same principles that built everything in the first place. After the meeting, I drove myself home, passing the hardware store on Main Street and the diner where Eleanor and I used to have breakfast every Saturday. Routine has a way of grounding you when other people are trying to unsettle your footing. That evening, Daniel called again, and this time his tone carried more urgency than confusion. He said Angela was worried that I did not trust them, that my reluctance to share details made her uncomfortable. I told him that trust is not measured by how much access you grant, but by how consistently you show respect. There was a long pause on the line. He asked if there was something specific Angela had done to upset me. I chose my words carefully. I told him that repeatedly attempting to obtain authority over someone's finances without being invited can create unnecessary strain. He sighed and admitted that Angela believed she was protecting their future. I asked him whether their future depended on decisions that were not theirs to make. Silence answered me before he did. 2 days later, they invited me to dinner at their home, which was unusual because most gatherings happened at my house. I arrived at 6:30 sharp, carrying a bottle of red wine as I always did. The atmosphere felt curated. Angela had set the table formally, candles lit, plates aligned precisely. During the meal, she spoke about long-term planning, about generational wealth, about how important it is for families to consolidate resources for efficiency. Her vocabulary had shifted. She was no longer asking as if I were incapable. She was positioning herself as strategic. I listened and took small bites of roasted chicken while Daniel nodded along. When she finished outlining her thoughts, she asked directly whether I would consider transferring certain assets into a shared family structure for simplicity. I placed my fork down and looked at her steadily. I told her that simplicity without mutual understanding can lead to complications. I explained that my arrangements were already designed to protect not only my interests but the stability of future generations, including potential grandchildren. That word caught her attention. Stability. It is a concept people often overlook when they focus only on immediate access. Angela leaned back in her chair, studying me as though recalculating once more. She asked whether there were investments she did not know about. I answered honestly. Yes, there were. I did not elaborate further. Daniel looked from her to me, clearly aware that the dynamic had shifted. For the first time, he seemed to recognize that the narrative he had accepted so easily might not be accurate. When dinner ended, and I prepared to leave, Angela walked me to the door. Her smile was polite but tighter than before. She said she hoped we could be more transparent with each other going forward. I told her transparency requires readiness to accept what you might discover. As I drove home under the streetlights, I realized the quiet advantage I held was no longer invisible. She understood now that there was depth she had not measured. And when someone realizes they have miscalculated, they do not retreat. They reassess. It was almost 2 weeks after that dinner when Angela made her boldest move yet. And this time she did not come to my house or invite me to hers. She called and suggested we all meet again at the bank to clarify everything once and for all. Her voice was steady, but beneath it I heard urgency, the kind that appears when patience has not produced the outcome someone expected. Daniel sounded hesitant when he confirmed the plan later that evening. He said Angela believed a joint conversation with management would eliminate misunderstandings. I agreed without resistance. There are moments in life when you allow events to unfold because the stage reveals more than private arguments ever could. The following Friday morning, I arrived at the bank 10 minutes early. I wore a navy suit I had not taken out of the closet in over a year. It still fit perfectly. I polished my shoes myself that morning, not out of vanity, but out of respect for the environment I was stepping back into. When Daniel and Angela walked through the front doors, I noticed the slight change in her expression. She had expected the cardigan. She had expected the old man image she was comfortable managing. Instead, she saw the version of me that had once run quarterly meetings with executives twice her age. We sat in the conference room near the back of the building. Thomas Reed joined us along with a senior financial officer who had worked under me years ago. The introductions were polite but formal. Angela began speaking first. She explained that she wanted clarity regarding my estate structure and future asset transitions so the family could plan responsibly. Her tone was professional, almost rehearsed. When she finished, Thomas turned to me rather than to her. He asked if I would like to address the board advisory updates that had recently been finalized. Angela's head turned slightly in his direction. Advisory updates. The room felt smaller for a moment. I spoke calmly, explaining that as a retained advisor and minority shareholder, I receive quarterly distributions and strategic reports. I described the trust structures already established to manage long-term stability, including philanthropic allocations and protected educational funds for future descendants. I did not dramatize it. I simply outlined facts the way I had done in countless meetings over 3 decades. Angela did not interrupt this time. She listened. The financial officer added that my portfolio remained one of the most conservatively structured and resilient within their private advisory group. Daniel looked at me as though he were seeing a dimension he had never examined. I could see the realization settle in. This was not hidden wealth discovered by accident. This was a lifetime of deliberate planning. Angela finally asked why none of this had been discussed openly before. I answered truthfully, because no one asked with respect. A silence followed, but it was different from the earlier silences in my kitchen or dining room. This one carried recognition. There is a moment when power shifts, not through volume or confrontation, but through clarity presented in front of witnesses. When the meeting concluded, Thomas shook my hand again and thanked me for my continued guidance on regional initiatives. Daniel remained quiet as we walked toward the exit. Angela's posture was composed, but the certainty she once carried had softened into something more cautious. Outside in the parking lot, Daniel finally spoke. He said he had underestimated me. I told him that underestimation often begins with assumptions. Angela did not argue. She simply nodded once, absorbing the reality that the narrative she had constructed no longer fit the facts in front of her. And as I drove away, I understood that what had changed was not my position, but her perception of it. The week after the meeting at the bank was noticeably quieter, not because the tension had vanished, but because it had transformed into something more restrained and observant. Angela no longer called every morning, and when she did reach out, her tone carried a careful politeness that had not been there before. Daniel stopped by alone one evening, standing on my porch with his hands in his jacket pockets like he used to when he was unsure how a conversation would unfold. He told me he had spent the last few days thinking about everything he had learned, about the advisory role, the structured trusts, the philanthropic allocations. He admitted that he had assumed my retirement meant withdrawal from relevance. I invited him inside and poured 2 glasses of water, setting them on the kitchen table where so many important conversations in our family had taken place. I told him that stepping back does not mean stepping down. It means choosing where your energy goes. 4 years my energy went into building institutions that would outlast me. After Eleanor passed, my energy went into preserving peace. That distinction matters. Daniel asked why I had never spoken openly about the scope of my involvement at the bank. I explained that true stability does not require an audience. Wealth that depends on recognition is fragile. Wealth that is structured quietly endures. He listened without interrupting this time. I could see that something inside him was recalibrating, not out of embarrassment, but out of realization. Later that week, Angela invited me to attend a community fundraiser the bank was sponsoring. It was the first time she had extended an invitation without attaching a financial proposal to it. The event was held in the town civic center, decorated with modest white linens and soft lighting. As we entered, several local business owners approached me to shake my hand, thanking me for prior support that Angela had clearly not known about. She remained composed, but I noticed she was observing the interactions carefully. Recognition can be unsettling when it contradicts your assumptions. During the evening, the bank chairman mentioned my name in a brief acknowledgement speech, referring to my years of service and continued advisory contributions. There was polite applause. I did not stand. I did not wave. I simply nodded once. When we sat back down, Angela leaned slightly toward me and said she had not realized how interconnected my history was with the town's growth. I told her history often works quietly beneath the surface. On the drive home, Daniel thanked me for attending. Angela remained thoughtful, no longer pushing, no longer strategizing out loud. I sensed that her ambition had not disappeared, but it had shifted direction. Ambition, when tempered by information, can become respect. The following Sunday, she called to ask if she could come by to discuss family legacy planning in a broader sense, not to access accounts, but to understand the principles behind the structures I had built. I agreed, not because I felt pressured, but because understanding is different from control. As I prepared my study for that conversation, organizing documents I was willing to share and setting aside those that remained private, I reflected on how quickly perception can change when truth is revealed in the right setting. I had not raised my voice. I had not denied assistance. I had simply allowed reality to present itself. And sometimes that is the most powerful response of all. Angela arrived the following Thursday afternoon carrying a slim leather notebook instead of a folder of documents. And that small change told me more than any apology could have. She sat across from me in my study, the late sunlight filtering through the blinds and casting narrow lines across the desk that had once held loan applications and expansion proposals. Daniel was at work, and for the first time this conversation was not staged as a united front. She began by saying she wanted to understand how I approached legacy planning, not because she questioned my competence, but because she realized she had never taken the time to learn the philosophy behind it. Her words were measured, careful. I listened without interrupting. Then I opened a single folder and slid it halfway across the desk, not close enough for her to take without permission, but close enough to show I was willing to share. Inside were summary pages outlining the structure of the family trust, the charitable endowment tied to the community college scholarship fund, and the long-term investment accounts designed to remain untouched for decades. I explained that real security is layered. Liquid assets for flexibility. Long-term holdings for growth. Protections that activate only under specific conditions. I told her that when you build something meant to outlast you, emotion cannot be the architect. Discipline must be. She wrote notes as I spoke. Not once did she reach for authority. Not once did she suggest revisions. Instead, she asked why I included performance benchmarks in beneficiary clauses. I answered honestly. Because inheritance without responsibility weakens character. Resources should expand opportunity, not replace effort. She nodded slowly, and I could see that this was not the conversation she expected months ago when she first held my bank statement in my kitchen. At one point, she asked whether I had ever considered placing Daniel in a more active advisory position. I told her that leadership roles are earned through demonstrated consistency, not proximity to me. I did not say it harshly. I said it as fact. After nearly an hour, she closed her notebook and looked at me directly. She admitted she had underestimated how intentionally everything had been structured. She said she mistook privacy for vulnerability. I appreciated the honesty. I told her that age often invites assumptions, and assumptions can cloud judgment. What matters is whether someone corrects course when new information appears. Before she left, she asked if there was a way she could contribute meaningfully without overstepping. That question carried a different weight than the one she had asked before. I suggested she begin by focusing on her own financial literacy, by building assets within her control rather than trying to manage mine. I recommended a few investment seminars hosted by the bank and offered to introduce her to a portfolio advisor if she wished. Empowerment, I explained, is stronger than access. When Daniel came by later that evening, Angela had already spoken to him. He thanked me for giving her the opportunity to learn instead of shutting her out. I told him that correction is more valuable than conflict. As I sat alone after they left, I reflected on how easily this story could have unfolded differently. Power displayed and anger invites resistance. Power revealed calmly invites recalibration. I had not needed to defend myself loudly. I had only needed to let the truth stand in full light. And sometimes that is enough to change the direction of an entire family dynamic. Over the next month, something subtle but meaningful began to change in our family rhythm. And it did not happen because of a dramatic confrontation or a rewritten document. It happened because expectations had been reset. Angela enrolled in 2 financial literacy workshops hosted by the bank on Thursday evenings, and Daniel mentioned that she had started reviewing their own retirement contributions more seriously. I did not monitor this progress. I simply observed it. Respect grows quietly when it is not forced. One Sunday afternoon, they invited me to join them for coffee at a small cafe near the town square, a place that opened only a few years ago with reclaimed wood tables and large front windows. We sat together without folders, without agendas. Angela asked about my early years at the bank, not about account balances, but about the lessons I learned during economic downturns. I told her about the recession in the early 1980s, about farmers who nearly lost their land, about the responsibility that comes with approving a loan that can change a family's trajectory for generations. She listened differently now, not as someone calculating leverage, but as someone studying experience. Daniel asked whether I had ever felt pressure managing that level of responsibility. I answered honestly. Pressure is constant when you lead. What matters is how you carry it. That afternoon, I also made something clear to both of them. I explained that the trusts and advisory roles were never designed to create hierarchy within our family. They were built to prevent instability. I told them that if either of them wanted to be more involved in legacy planning in the future, the path was simple. Demonstrate consistency, build independent strength, and approach conversations with mutual respect. Access would never be granted out of fear. It could only grow out of trust. Angela nodded and said she understood now that influence without preparation can create more harm than good. Hearing that, I felt something release inside me. Not anger, not resentment, just relief that clarity had replaced assumption. Later that week, I received a letter from the community college informing me that this year's scholarship recipient had accepted admission into an engineering program. I forwarded the letter to Daniel and Angela so they could see the broader impact of the structures we had discussed. Angela replied with a thoughtful message about long-term community investment, and for the first time her interest aligned with mine rather than competing against it. One evening Daniel came by alone again and admitted that he had relied too heavily on Angela's interpretation of my situation earlier in the year. He said he should have asked more questions himself instead of assuming decline where there was simply discretion. I told him that adulthood requires independent judgment, even within marriage. That statement was not meant to divide them. It was meant to remind him of his own agency. As the seasons began to shift and the maple tree in my yard started shedding leaves across the driveway, I realized that what had once felt like a potential fracture in our family had become a lesson in boundaries. I had not needed to threaten. I had not needed to withdraw affection. I had only needed to stand firmly in truth and allow others to adjust their understanding. And in doing so, I had protected not only my assets, but something far more important, which was the integrity of how I am seen within my own family. Autumn settled in fully by the time October arrived, and with it came a clarity that felt earned rather than imposed. The maple tree in my front yard had turned a deep amber, and each morning I swept the fallen leaves from the driveway with steady strokes, the rhythm almost meditative. Routine has always been my anchor. Stability is not created in grand gestures, but in consistent, quiet action. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by carrying a folder of his own. This time it was not a proposal directed at me. It was his retirement plan summary, a breakdown of his contributions, debts, and savings goals. He set it on the kitchen table and asked if I would review it, not to control it, but to advise him. That distinction mattered. I read through the numbers carefully, asking questions about interest rates, long-term projections, and emergency reserves. Angela joined us halfway through the conversation, and instead of positioning herself as the strategist, she listened as Daniel explained his reasoning. When she did speak, it was to ask how they could strengthen their own foundation before thinking about inheritance. That shift was more meaningful than any apology. I told them that generational strength begins with independence. If you build your life expecting someone else's resources to stabilize it, you remain vulnerable. But if you build your own structure first, anything additional becomes a blessing rather than a necessity. We discussed diversification, disciplined saving, and the importance of living below one's means even when income rises. I shared stories of clients who expanded too quickly during prosperous years and struggled when markets corrected. They listened without defensiveness. For the first time, the conversation felt collaborative instead of corrective. A few weeks later, the bank hosted its annual advisory dinner, and I invited Daniel and Angela to attend as my guests. The event was modest but dignified, held in a private dining room at a local hotel with white tablecloths and soft lighting. During introductions, I presented Daniel not as my successor, but as a professional building his own path. Angela was introduced as an entrepreneur exploring long-term financial literacy initiatives. The language mattered. Identity should reflect effort, not expectation. Throughout the evening, they engaged thoughtfully with other attendees, asking questions about regional development and sustainable investment. I watched from a slight distance, not intervening, not orchestrating. Leadership sometimes means stepping back and allowing others to find their footing. On the drive home, Daniel thanked me for including them in that environment. He said it changed how he viewed responsibility. Angela added that she understood now why privacy had been important to me. Not secrecy. Privacy. There is a difference. Privacy protects what is still being built. Secrecy hides what cannot withstand light. I had never been hiding. I had simply refused to perform. That night, as I sat alone in my living room with a cup of tea, I reflected on how close we had come to misunderstanding each other permanently. Assumptions, left unchecked, can fracture families quietly. But clarity, delivered without anger, can rebuild respect just as quietly. I had not altered my estate in retaliation. I had strengthened it in alignment with principle. I had not withdrawn affection. I had set boundaries. And in doing so, I had shown them that dignity does not fade with age. It deepens. The house felt peaceful again, not because conflict had never existed, but because it had been addressed with steadiness instead of pride. And as the wind moved gently through the trees outside, I understood that the true legacy I was protecting was not measured in dollars. It was measured in how we treat one another when power is misunderstood. Winter arrived quietly that year, laying a thin sheet of frost across the rooftops and turning my morning walks into brisk reminders that time moves forward whether we resist it or not. The air felt sharper, but inside my home there was a calm that had not existed months earlier. Daniel and Angela began coming over on Sunday afternoons without agenda, sometimes bringing homemade soup, sometimes simply sitting at the kitchen table and talking about work, about the market, about ordinary things. Ordinary can be a gift when tension has faded. One evening, as snow drifted lightly against the windows, Daniel asked if I would consider documenting the principles behind my estate planning and writing, not as a legal document, but as guidance for the future. He said that understanding my reasoning had changed how he approached his own responsibilities. Angela agreed, adding that structured thinking was more valuable than unrestricted access. I appreciated the request because it reflected maturity rather than entitlement. Over the next several weeks, I drafted a personal letter to accompany the formal trust documents, outlining the values that shaped every decision. I wrote about discipline, about patience during economic downturns, about the difference between liquidity and longevity. I wrote about Eleanor and how we agreed early in our marriage that wealth should serve purpose, not ego. I explained why certain assets were shielded, why philanthropic commitments were embedded, and why performance benchmarks existed for beneficiaries. Not to control them, but to encourage growth. When I finished, I invited Daniel and Angela over and read portions aloud. They listened carefully. There was no interruption, no attempt to renegotiate terms. Only attention. Angela later admitted that earlier in the year she had viewed inheritance as a safety net they should secure quickly. Now she saw it as a responsibility that required preparation. That shift mattered more than any clause in a contract. Around the holidays, the bank sent an invitation for a small advisory recognition gathering, and this time Daniel insisted on attending not as my guest, but as an observer eager to learn. During the event, he introduced himself confidently, not as someone waiting for transition, but as someone building independently. Angela spoke with a local nonprofit director about collaborative initiatives, expressing interest in contributing through her own efforts. I stood nearby and watched without interference. The difference between then and now was not measured in titles or distributions. It was measured in posture. Respect had replaced presumption. Later that night, after the gathering, Daniel thanked me again, not for financial support, but for demonstrating steadiness under pressure. He said he understood now that silence does not equal weakness. It can be strategy. I told him that composure is often mistaken for decline when viewed through impatient eyes. As the year drew to a close and I sat alone by the fireplace, reflecting on everything that had unfolded, I realized that the most important adjustment I made was not to my portfolio. It was to my boundaries. I allowed truth to surface in public settings where it could not be dismissed. I reinforced structures without retaliation. I offered guidance without surrendering control. And in doing so, I preserved both my independence and my family. Snow continued to fall outside, covering the yard in a clean layer of white. Some people assume that aging reduces influence. They forget that influence built over decades does not vanish. It simply waits for the right moment to remind others that it has always been there. Spring arrived almost unnoticed, the snow dissolving into damp earth and small green shoots pushing up through the lawn beneath the maple tree I planted when Daniel was 10 years old. One Saturday morning he stood beside me in the driveway, hands in his pockets, watching as I finished sweeping away the last of the winter debris. Angela joined us a few minutes later, carrying coffee for all three of us. There was no tension in her posture now, no quiet calculation behind her eyes, just awareness. Daniel cleared his throat and said he had something he wanted to tell me. He explained that he and Angela had finalized a long-term savings plan of their own, adjusted their spending, and committed to building their future without assuming anything about mine. He said they wanted to stand on their own strength first. I listened carefully, not because I doubted them, but because moments like that deserve full attention. Angela added that the past year had taught her something she did not expect to learn. She said she had confused access with security. She had believed that proximity to my assets would protect their future. What she understands now is that true security comes from preparation, discipline, and respect. Her words were steady, honest. I nodded once and told them that growth is the only inheritance that cannot be revoked. Later that afternoon, we sat together at the kitchen table, the same table where this entire journey had quietly begun months earlier, when a single sentence revealed how I was being seen. I remembered the tone of that day, the assumption, the way weakness had been projected onto me simply because I had chosen a quieter life. I looked at Daniel and Angela now and saw something different. Not fear, not ambition disguised as concern. I saw understanding. I told them that I never needed them to see me as powerful. I only needed them to see me accurately. Age does not erase capability. Simplicity does not mean scarcity. Silence does not mean surrender. They both nodded, and there was no defensiveness left in the room. As the afternoon light shifted across the countertops, Angela asked if she could help organize some of Eleanor's old photo albums so that future children might know the family story. That request meant more to me than any request for account access ever could. We spent the next hour turning pages, laughing softly at outdated hairstyles and faded vacation snapshots. The house felt alive again, not because of money, but because of restored perspective. That evening, after they left, I walked through each room slowly, pausing by the window where the sunlight had once caught dust in the air on the day everything changed. I realized that the most significant victory had not taken place at the bank or in a conference room. It had happened in perception. I did not raise my voice. I did not retaliate. I allowed truth to stand on its own until it could no longer be ignored. And in doing so, I preserved both my dignity and my family. The maple tree outside is taller now than I ever imagined it would be when I first placed that small sapling into the ground decades ago. Strength takes time. Roots grow quietly. And when the seasons change, the tree does not argue for its presence. It simply stands, exactly where it has always been.